Good afternoon. I'm John Walters, and I'm President and CEO of Hudson Institute. I want to welcome everybody here and welcome those who are joining this on a live stream. This session is entitled Regulatory and Reputational Risks in China, Forced Labor, and the U.S. Government's Contribution to a Global Response. I'm going to briefly introduce our two speakers, but first I want to just say just my own view of the importance of this issue. Actually, since I've met Nury Turkel and read his book, and since Hudson does a fair amount of work on this area, both in terms of trade and in terms of strategic policy, I will say that this is a problem that is difficult for me personally not to think about each day. And I recognize that it's not only a problem in China, but it's a problem in other places. That is the use of oppression and forced labor. Wherever it happens, it's bad, and it happens in some cases even in the United States. But on a mass scale, to suppress and commit a kind of genocide is something that is bothersome not only as a country who stands for other principles, but I think as individuals who are forced, I think, if they want to be what they say they are, not to look away, not to tolerate, not to just not enable, and not buy products made by that kind of oppression, but also to do more. And in our effort to try to talk about what we can do as both an individuals, a country, and as a country, we couldn't have a better speaker here today. And I want to thank him for joining us. Robert Silvers was confirmed by the Senate as Undersecretary for Strategy and Policy and Plans on August 5th, 2021. He is responsible for driving policy and implementation plans all across the Department of Homeland Security and its missions, including counterterrorism, cybersecurity, infrastructure security and resilience, border security and immigration, international affairs, trade, and economic security. Mr. Silvers previously served in the Department of Homeland Security during the Obama and Biden administrations as Assistant Secretary for Cyber Policy. In that role, he oversaw private sector engagement, federal government incident response, and diplomatic outreach pertaining to cybersecurity and emerging technology. Mr. Silvers also previously served as DHS Deputy Chief of Staff, managing the execution of policy and operational priorities across the entire department. Prior to his appointment, he was a partner at the law firm Paul Hastings in town. The Department of Homeland Security was being formed when I was last in government in a galaxy far away long ago in the Bush administration. And so I have some knowledge of the far-flung responsibilities and difficulties of running a department that big with that many responsibilities. It's one of those things kind of Congress creates and then throws it into the executive branch lap and says, make it make sense. And by the way, if you make any mistakes, we'll be sure to second guess you along the way. I mentioned Nury Turkel is a senior fellow at Hudson Institute, specializing in national security, foreign policy, and issues of forced labor and supply chain risks. He's also an attorney specializing in international corporate compliance, U.S. government enforcement relating to Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and other anti-corruption and human rights standards. Nury was born in a re-education camp at the height of China's Cultural Revolution. He spent the first several months of his life in detention with his mother. He came to the United States in 1995 as a student and was granted asylum in 1998. In May 2020, he was appointed by Congress to the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Many of his recommendations have been incorporated into laws and pending legislation relating to China, including the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act of 2020. He's also the founder and chairman of the board of Uyghur Human Rights Project, and he served as president of the Uyghur American Association. I want to thank both of them for their attending this event and the important work that they're both doing. So without any further ado, Nury and Rob, thank you.
Thank you very much, John. I'm profoundly grateful, not only for your being an exemplary leader, but all the support that you provided me, my work here at the Hudson Institute. Thank you. I wanted to thank you all for being here. I am delighted to have this conversation, even though it's a very grim topic, it's a very distressful topic, but this is something, as John noted, deserves a lot of attention. The United States government have legal tools, including the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act that was signed into law in December 2021, and its landmark rebuttable presumption went into effect last summer. This law is arguably the most important legislative mandate that Congress put in place to address some of the lingering issues we have with Communist China in our trade relationship since China joined the WTO about 2 decades ago. This legislative mandate improves the existing U.S. regime banning imports made with forced labor. This is done in 2 critical ways. First, it establishes the assumption by statute that any goods, wares, articles, merchandise mined, produced, or manufactured wholly or in part in Xinjiang are made with forced labor, unless proven otherwise by clear and convincing evidence. The second, the law requires the Interagency Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force, which was established under the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Free Trade Agreement, USMCA is commonly known, to develop a strategy to prevent the imports of goods made with forced labor from the Xinjiang region. I'm so delighted that Undersecretary Rob Silvers took the time to visit Hudson today. Thank you and welcome. In addition to serving a top policy official at the DHS, as John introduced, Undersecretary Silvers is tasked with this challenging responsibility to oversee, implement, and enforce this statutory policy as the chair of the Interagency Task Force. I wanted to start with something just happened a couple of days ago here in Washington. U.S. Customs and Border Protection, CBP, held an expo on tools for supply chain transparency this week. And I'd like to share a quote from Dr. Laura Murphy from her presentation. As some of you know, that her work on supply chain tracing has been vital and informative to key actors responsible for crafting policy responses to modern-day slavery. In her remarks to the business leaders and others gathered at this event on Wednesday, she said, "You're talking about your business risk, your legal risk. I'm talking about the risk of participating in genocide, of financing a genocide, because that's what we're doing." She also said, "Until you're doing every single thing you can do to make sure you change what's happening for the Uyghur people, or at least make sure you're not profiting from them, then you should not sleep at night." That is a heavy indictment of business leaders, investors, and all of us as consumers. I want to jump right into the question with some questions, Mr. Undersecretary. You feel free to comment on Dr. Murphy's work and her remarks. But I wanted to ask you, I want to begin asking, new export bans, investment ban, and specially designated national SDNs filled with the Federal Register on rolling basis, and if you can explain why this is happening.
Yeah, first, thank you to the Hudson Institute. Thank you, Nury. For those watching, you should know that Nury is a true, not only friend to me and the Department of Homeland Security, but an inspiration to all of us for his life story, his perseverance, his pursuit of justice, and his leadership as chair of the Commission on International Religious Freedom, as founder of the Uyghur Human Rights Project, and so many other capacities. So it's an honor to be here with you, Nury.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
So I want to first pick up on something you said in your introduction about how this is a grim topic.
Yeah.
It is a grim topic, but what that makes me want to do is not turn away from it and avert our eyes, but instead shine a light on it that is brighter and brighter and brighter, because we have to eradicate this grim problem of forced labor, of slave labor around the world, because it is a problem around the world, and it is a particularly acute problem in Xinjiang province in China, as you know. And we see in Xinjiang province very well documented track record of forced labor conditions, detention conditions, concentration camp type conditions for ethnic Uyghurs. We see systemic schemes to remove Uyghurs and other persecuted minorities from Xinjiang province to other parts of China to engage in forced labor there. And this is something that we cannot rest until we have eradicated. And as chair of the Federal Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force, that is one of the things I think of every day when I come into the office of how can we progress further in learning about the scope of this problem, developing leads that we can investigate, and then bringing enforcement authorities to bear to clamp down on those kinds of goods coming into this country. You mentioned sanctions lists and entity lists. One element of the new Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act that you mentioned that passed a little over a year ago is that DHS for the first time was charged to create a sanctions list of companies known to traffic in forced labor. We did that when we implemented the law in June of last year. And one of our highest priorities for 2023 is to add additional entities to that list because we are very aware based on reporting, credible reporting from the NGO and other communities that there's a significant number of companies that are operating in Xinjiang or around Xinjiang that are engaging in these abhorrent practices, and we want to name them, and we want to ensure that their goods do not come into this country.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I wanted to ask you about the boardrooms, like corporate world. Are the boardrooms adequately prioritizing their response to the regulatory and reputational risk of potential complicity in the ongoing atrocity crimes against this vulnerable ethno-religious group?
Some are, but many are still learning. And one of my key messages to the community is that forced labor is now a top-tier compliance issue. For many years, companies have built compliance programs to handle risks around issues like anti-corruption and the FCPA, sanctions, export controls compliance, privacy. We need to add forced labor compliance to that list, especially with the passage of landmark laws like the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. And so this is an issue for compliance teams, to be sure, but it's also an issue for C-suites. It's an issue for boards. And to the apropos of the title of our discussion today, it is of course a legal risk and a compliance risk, a business risk. It's also a reputational risk for companies, and I think some companies have found that out. And so this is something that companies absolutely need to hone in on, and one of my priorities since we began implementing this law in the summer of last year is to engage with the corporate community to talk about how serious we are about our expectations as the regulator in this space, that they have robust supply chain tracing, supply chain transparency, due diligence programs to really understand far down their supply chains. That's the only way that we are going to get at the mission, the goal of these forced labor laws, which is to eradicate the problem at the source.
As a compliance lawyer, I do understand the process in the business world a little bit. One common question comes up is due diligence. What kind of due diligence that we, in the compliance programs that we force individuals in charge of that process to be vigilant and fully responsible for. So in your role as the chair of the task force, what kind of role that due diligence requirements can play in the nature of mandatory requirement, for example?
So we do have mandatory requirements that we've articulated for what we expect to see, particularly for shipments that are coming in that have a nexus to Xinjiang or a company that's known to operate using these oppressive labor practices. And we actually developed and issued landmark guidance to industry that the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force did, laying out what are the ingredients of a key due diligence program. And in addition to knowing your vendors, knowing your supply chain, knowing your consultants, understanding all the way down the supply chain, and understanding the labor practices of those who feed components into whatever your business processes are, there's also, fortunately, a host of new technologies that are helping companies engage in this compliance and to be able to deepen in an efficient way the way that they're able to penetrate through supply chains that can be murky. I mean, it's a complex international economic ecosystems. A lot of the times you have components shipped to one country, they're assembled, shipped back to the same country where they're further assembled and finished, and you have many tiers of the supply chain. There are really incredible technology applications that are including harnessing artificial intelligence and other data analytics that are really helping with this. And it is heartening because there is so much discussion now of transnational repression, of how authoritarian governments are using technology to repress, to surveil, to undermine human rights. And that's all true. Technology can also be a force for human rights. It can be a force for transparency and sunlight and for remediation. And that is, we both spoke at the Tech Expo, the CBP Tech Expo earlier this week, and I think that's the key point there.
Do you hear, when you engage with the business communities, do they ever express any concerns that it is next to nothing to conduct adequate due diligence in a region or on a people whose basic human rights literally reduced to acts of genocide today? Like, do they express any difficulties and challenges? When I testified in Congress in 2019, this was one of the key issues, that hearing and subsequent actions paved the way for the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, and this was one of the key questions. I do genuinely believe that it's difficult.
It is difficult, and we hear that, and I think that the truth is the vast majority of U.S. companies, I think, want to have compliance in this area. I think they are repulsed by the notion that there might be slave labor in their supply chains. I think they want to do the right thing. I think some of them have expressed concern to me and others that it's hard. One, there's not a lot of transparency in the Chinese system. So it can be hard, even for a company that does want to find out more, it can just be hard to learn. And sometimes with certain commodities, it can be hard to really trace back to the raw materials level. The industries just over time haven't been necessarily designed to be able to trace where this shipment came from versus that shipment. And materials can be commingled and mixed together, and it adds complexity. What we're doing is we're working really closely with industry on a daily basis to help them, and we're learning from them and they're learning from us. And through that, we are gaining confidence in our ability to be satisfied that some shipments truly have a legitimate provenance and aren't tainted by forced labor. And when we've been able to establish that with a company, often through weeks or months of trading paperwork and bills of materials and purchase orders, I mean, we really get into it because it's very important to us to get it right. But once we can get it right with a company, often that company sees a lot of efficiency because when future shipments come in that have identical supply chains, we understand it, we've learned it with them, and the shipments can come in quite efficiently. There's other instances in which companies haven't been able to satisfy the burden, and in that case, their product is going to have to be destroyed or re-exported.
some businesses suggested that they can conduct due diligence. And I also, the readings that I have done, the access to people conduct due diligence is not even close to the level of access available in Bangladesh when we compare it to the access in China. So to me, this comes across as some sort of a reluctance or an excuse not to follow the law. That's a very separate. That's a separate topic. But let's move on to the next question. That's very important. This is something that has been in the minds of many people. The law have been implemented almost 9 months now. If you could describe the process at DHS, the implementation process, what kind of challenges, obstacles that you have encountered in your leadership role and the enforcement implementation?
Sure. Listen, this was what we call a greenfield project.
Yeah.
I mean, we've been enforcing forced labor laws for a long time, but this set new legal standards, new criteria for evaluation, and candidly, a much stricter set of criteria than some past labor laws, forced labor laws. And so we had to build an entire architecture for the implementation and enforcement, and we had 6 months to do it. Right. The law passed at the end of December 2021, and we actually did our work a few days before the 6-month deadline. So we were on time, and the challenges were a few. One, creation of this new sanctions list, which we call the forced labor entity list, which had never existed before, and creating standard operating procedures for the nomination and consideration of new entities for designation to that list. Two, developing guidance for industry. What does it mean? What are you going to need to show at the port to substantiate the legitimacy of your supply chains? And so we developed and socialized with industry and got feedback, really granular advice on those sort of trade practices and what kind of documentation needed to be developed. We also put a focus, is very important, on deepening our relationships with civil society. When it comes to, we have incredible relationships with a number of civil society organizations, human rights activist groups, and they're not only partners of ours and sort of stakeholders, we literally can't do it without them. We get leads, we get investigative leads from these incredible organizations that are in the field, often covertly and at great danger, collecting information on the ground in China and sharing it with us. And based on that, we review it and we have taken enforcement actions. And so we really put a priority on, just as we are engaging with industry to make sure that they can understand the rules, because we do want to facilitate lawful trade. I mean, that's very important, that lawful trade be able to come in quickly. Our economy depends on it. But we also want to make sure we are really tightly bound up with civil society and to make sure that we're getting all their feedback on what's really going on out there that we should be attuned to from an enforcement perspective. Now, so in terms of difficulties, whenever you have a new compliance regime, there's a lot of uncertainty. There's just a lot of uncertainty. People say, I'm not sure how they're going to interpret this provision or that. What exact kind of documentation will they expect to see? Will this shipment get in or that shipment? There's just uncertainty that's very natural, and we felt that in the opening months of this process, to be sure. And what we've done is it's a learning process for everyone because it is brand new. Industry has learned, we've learned, and what we've done is we've issued new guidance as we are learning to make sure the community is benefiting from it. So we put out initial guidance when we rolled out in June of last year, but then just a few weeks ago, we rolled out a best practices document based on lessons learned. We rolled out a draft table of contents that shows the kinds of documents in a successful package to substantiate the supply chain of a shipment. and more.
Yeah.
And we also are, we need to be transparent with the community. So we just rolled out earlier this week a new online dashboard showing enforcement metrics by dollar amount, by where the cargo was from, by the commodity or product type, because we need the community to know, and the community deserves to know.
Yeah, I saw the dashboard. It's quite impressive.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I thank you for sharing sharing your thoughts and describing the challenges and obstacles. But I'm curious to know, what is the next step for the task force? What are the things that the task force is prioritizing in order to achieve full implementation of the law?
Absolutely. So I think we are at full implementation, but I think like any enforcement regime, it continues and continues.
Yeah.
And I think one is the entity list.
Yeah.
We're really strongly committed to building that out and expanding it to include any other entities that we identify that are engaged in these abhorrent practices. A piece of that, by the way, is the ability to take an entity off the entity list if they've remediated. And we've done that before the Uyghur Act with just our legacy forced labor enforcement authorities. We've designated a company, and then the company has, that hits the company hard.
Right.
And the company has cleaned up its act, remediated, instituted reforms, proven that to us, and we'll take them off the sanctions list. And that's a huge win. That's making the world a better place and showing improvement through action. So the entity list is a big piece of it. We continue to realize just efficiencies. Anytime you're new, you're going to have growing pains. We think that we're able over the course of this year to increase processing efficiency a lot without sacrificing at all at the rigor of our enforcement, and to get really both speedy and surgical and also strong. We're able to do all that. I mentioned technology. We're interested in some tech pilots. So for example, can we use DNA testing to tell whether cotton was grown in Xinjiang province versus somewhere else? That's really reliable, it's fast, and it can clear good cargo through and keep tainted cargo out. So we're really interested in technology.
Wonderful. Do you have any examples or precedent that the laws in this nature help to eradicate forced labor? Often Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan comes to mind. Would you be willing to speak to that if there's any good examples that we can recommend to the businesses in addition to them to follow the law?
Absolutely. There have been examples where after we have issued what's called a withhold release order, which is our sort of the type of enforcement action that we can take to prohibit cargo from coming in because it is the product of forced labor, we can work to validate that a company has, for example, improved housing conditions or pay conditions for its workforce, that it has cleaned up its practices with respect to recruiting and transporting workers to make sure that's all humane, consensual, and the like. And there are a number of examples where we have been able to do that, and where conditions have improved rapidly. And so, absolutely.
I have one final question before we open the floor to the participants. The international cooperation. As you know, you and I have talked about this. We cannot do this alone. We cannot do this alone because of the magnitude and scope and scale of the problem that we're dealing with. We're talking about more than 80 global brands. In your engagement with our partners and allies, do you see convergence on this issue? I'm eager to see them joining the effort. This is not just a simple geopolitical, economic, or competition issue. This is a moral issue, and Europeans know it better, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I do see convergence, but it's not converging as quickly as I would like.
Yeah.
And that is one of my priorities for this year, is to work to persuade like-minded countries to pursue similar regimes, enforcement regimes in their own systems, whether that be in Europe, in Japan, Australia, India, and more. You know, you said it just right, Nury. The goal here is to eradicate forced labor.
Yeah.
We're never going to be able to do that if there are markets that are open to products made with forced labor.
Yeah.
The other thing is that, fortunately, this is an area where there should be a convergence of interests, because the use of forced labor, in addition to being a human rights atrocity and a moral imperative to address on its own right, and that's why we do it, but it also undercuts workers. It undercuts businesses that are playing by the rules and are treating their workers well, and we should treat workers well.
Yeah.
And I think I'm hopeful that countries in Europe and elsewhere will see that.
Yeah.
And that's become, among the many hats that I wear in my position, because the Department of Homeland Security is such a big place with so many disparate missions. I lead the international affairs function for our department, and so this has really vaulted to the top of our diplomatic priorities as we're engaging across the world.
I just wanted to thank you for the simple message, simple but very powerful message. When I heard this first time, it just hit me hard, even though somebody who's so immersed in this work, that you're absolutely right that forced labor is a cancer in our values. I mean, this is not that difficult. It sounds patronizing, condescending, but some countries in Europe still not fully apprehending the type of problem that they are being part of. So I wanted to, if you're okay with, I'd like to open the floor for questions. If anyone who has questions, feel free to ask. Yes, Michael.
Hi, I'm Michael Martin from Reuters.
Wait for the microphone.
Hi again. Thanks for being here. I'm Michael Martino with Reuters News. I know you're here mostly talking about the forced labor aspects of this. I wanted to ask about Hikvision. This is a company, as an American consumer, I can go online, I can go on Amazon right now, and I can buy products from Hikvision, which have been linked to mass surveillance in Xinjiang. From your perspective at DHS, how do you view this? Do you support adding Hikvision to, say, the SDN list at Treasury, and have you had any conversations with counterparts at Treasury about how to do that and if that should be done?
So I strongly support, and the Biden administration strongly supports, taking actions to punish companies that are complicit in human rights abuses. And I'm not going to comment on particular pending actions in particular companies in this setting, but we've actually issued sanctions or put on the Commerce Department's entity list and otherwise taken actions against companies that have, through their businesses, eroded human rights or been complicit with governments that do that. We've done that in the context of spyware. We've done that in the context of companies that enable the Chinese surveillance state or the crimes against humanity that are ongoing in Xinjiang province. And we will continue to do so.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Thank you very much for the presentation. It was very enlightening. David June from White and Case down the road. I have a question. Does the Chinese government, are they reacting to this new legislation, the implementation, or are they just ignoring it, hoping it would not succeed? That's my question.
So I've read public statements from the PRC government complaining about the legislation, yeah. Yeah, they seem they seem not to support they seem not to support the legislation.
I think I can comment. This has been part of China's political economy. They invested in the ongoing genocide, so much resources, so much money. We're talking about a massive camp system that the world has not seen since the Holocaust era. We're talking about the most sophisticated surveillance system that they set up. New Yorker magazine has a piece describing Chen Zhenguo, who was sanctioned by the US government under Global Magnitsky Act, operating from an old government hotel with massive computer screens. So yeah, they need to find a way to recoup their investment. In addition to that, as some people in media often say, China alleviated millions of people out of poverty. That created labor shortage. So they need to solve that problem as well. So yeah, of course they are unhappy, and it's not our business if they're happy or not. We need to keep doing the right thing.
At a certain point, you do need, in whatever your line of work,
Yeah.
You need to step back for a minute and say, what do we stand for?
Right,
Or what do
right.
I stand for?
Right.
And this, to me, is one of our mission spaces where I know what we stand for, and it's the right thing. It's standing for human rights and individual rights and the rights not to be persecuted because of the color of your skin or your religion or your ethnicity, and to enjoy liberty and life. And we have just seen, we've seen darkness in Xinjiang province. We continue to see darkness, and this is hard work.
Yeah.
And there are different opinions out there about whether we ought to do it or not. We're continuing to do it.
Thank you very much. Anyone else?
Thank you. My name's Trevor. I just had a quick question. I know that this discussion has been really regulatory focused, but I'm curious, how do you go about changing consumer attitudes towards this issue? It's one thing, I think, a very important thing, obviously, to address how corporations do business globally and how they, conduct due diligence of supply chains and assess their supply chains. But how do you go about changing consumers' attitudes on this topic?
So I think that consumers have shown an interest over time in buying products that are consistent with their values. And I think most people would be, I think most Americans don't think about where the T-shirt that they're wearing comes from in that way. But I, that's not because they're bad people. It's just, it's an awareness issue, right? I think the vast majority of Americans would be horrified to learn that apparel or electronics or tomatoes or what have you that they are enjoying were made by people living in slave conditions. And so I do think consumer awareness is an important piece of this. It's not the piece that the Department of Homeland Security focuses on. Ours is really investigations for cargo coming into the country. But I see that kind of question as being a part of a complementary set of efforts that can further the mission work, because if consumers are aware, that incentivizes businesses to care and to do more robust due diligence. And that's helpful to our mission because it means less illicit cargo is being sent here, and it's that is one step closer to accomplishing the mission. Another example is there are investors out there that make a point of only investing in companies that have credible and strong due diligence programs around forced labor. That's the other. That's again that's not what we do, but that's another sort of complementary, growing movement in the broader ecosystem in which our societies as a whole can move towards a place where we do not tolerate the presence of forced labor in our supply chains.
Just compliment Undersecretary's excellent points. The consumer's already spoken out. As you may recall, last year, there was a call to not to watch the Winter Olympics. And American people, Canadian people responded. As a result, the CBC, NBC viewership dropped half, nearly 50%. That's a huge response. I was so pleased to see that response. So when the consumers speak out, corporate boardrooms hear and adjust. And the other thing is that, when you look at the type of support that this particular bill received in the midst of supply chain crisis, inflation, it's quite remarkable. What we're talking about here is every single senator unanimously supporting, over 400 member of Congress. We have 435, close to everyone, except for a few people. Our Congress is representing the American people. So the American people demand that our government takes action on this. So that's a very powerful message to the Chinese government, to the businesses, and our allies and partners around the world.
It's rare to have, these days, it seems rare to have bipartisan
Absolutely.
issues that we can rally around. I really think this is one of them. This is an American issue.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, sir. This would be our final question.
Yeah, I'm with the Japanese newspaper Sankei Shimbun. You mentioned earlier that so-called like-minded countries such as Japan or Australia sharing your concern and policies on the Chinese government's oppression of the human rights in Xinjiang province, But I am sure that there are some areas that their position, Australia or Japanese government, diverge from their policy or even your perception. So I'm wondering if there's any specific territory or points that you might wish that those countries, like-minded countries, would come closer to your position or take similar actions.
Sure. Well, one area, and it's not specific to Japan, it's broad, where I think we can be doing better is information sharing between our enforcement authorities here in the United States and the enforcement authorities, whether it be usually the customs agencies or others of partner countries on forced labor. Because if we have detected that shipments from a certain importer are linked to forced labor, we can use that information to detect similar shipments in the future that are coming here. But we think that enforcement authorities in other countries should benefit from that information as well, so that the forced labor products don't just end up being re-exported there and the market stays viable for that kind of heinous working condition. And so to your question, one thing that we are really focused on is trying to build that information capability and connective tissue between U.S. enforcement authorities and enforcement authorities in other countries.
Just to add before we close, some countries have an existing legal tools. They need to start using it. It's not exactly designed for addressing forced labor practices, but the countries like Canada, UK have legal measures that can go after individuals responsible for this kind of worst forms of human rights abuses. So with that, with those insightful comments, I will conclude with my own comment by reminding us that economic gain must not come at the cost of all morality and humanity. It's a duty of both the government and private sector to ensure that American people are not unwittingly funding atrocity crimes with their dollars. I am very, very grateful again. I can't thank you enough for your leadership in this noble work. I am very grateful with the leaders like that. I'm hopeful that we can be able to eradicate the cancer that you have been eloquently speaking of from our values. I wanted to thank you all for taking the time on Friday afternoon to join us. and also on a very special day, St. Patrick's Day, for being here. You've been very gracious with your time. Thank you again. Please come back. We would like to continue this conversation with you.
Thank you, Nury.
Thank you.